The shagreen case was where she had left it, on the dressing-room chest, and the warped door beyond it had drifted open the width of a finger, and through that finger of dark she saw her husband's bare shoulder in the pier glass, and heard him laugh in a voice she had never been given. Charlotte did not move. The candle in her hand did not tremble, which surprised her later more than anything else that happened that night. She had come for the box. That was the only errand. The miniature of Lady Ashbrook's youngest needed another sitting in the morning, and the ivories were inside, and the ground pigments in their stoppered files, and the brushes she trusted. And so she had crossed the corridor in her wrapper after the house had gone quiet, because Theodore disliked her working past midnight, and she had learned to spare him the sight of it. The dressing-room door had been pulled to, but not latched. It never latched. The frame had warped the winter of the great flood 3 years before her marriage, and the joiner had been promised and never sent for, and Charlotte had filed that small fact away with the rest of the small facts she filed away, because a miniaturist's habit is to notice and to keep. She had crossed to the chest. She had bent. She had put her hand on the cool shagreen, which was rough as a fish's back under her palm, and faintly warm where her body had passed it, and she had heard the laugh. It was Theodore's laugh. It was also not. She had heard the public one, the one he used at table, at the hunt, in the long gallery when guests admired the Varenne portraits, and he stood at her elbow and accepted the praise on her behalf. The public laugh was 3 notes and a closed mouth. This one was open. It went on. It was the laugh of a man who had nothing to defend. And Charlotte, who had been 3 years married to him and had never heard it, understood in the same breath that she had been kept on the other side of a door she had not known was there. She had not meant to look. She had meant to lift the box and go. But the pier glass beyond the warped door stood at the angle the maid set it every morning, and the bed beyond the pier glass was lit by one candle her husband had not bothered to snuff, and the angle the maid set it every morning was the angle that returned the bed to anyone standing at the chest. Charlotte's hand stayed on the case. Her eyes went, of their own accord, to the glass. Theodore was on his side, propped on one elbow, his hair loose. The other man lay, with his back against the headboard, one knee drawn up under the sheet, a glass of something amber tipped against his thigh. Charlotte knew the second man by his profile, before she knew him by name. Captain Lucien Fay, who had come to dinner 4 times in the past season, who had stood for his likeness in her studio, at Theodore's insistence, and held his head as still as a dog, and complimented the quality of the light. The likeness lay in the bottom drawer of her shagreen case at this moment, wrapped in pale silk, dated and keyed in the cipher she had used since she was 16, because Theodore had said only, "Paint me a friend," and Charlotte had learned by then that a friend was a word her husband used when he wished a thing not to be named. She did not breathe. The candle in her hand burned steady. The shagreen under her other palm grew warm, then warmer, as if the box were the thing that held her upright. Theodore was saying something about the south wing. The south wing had drains that wanted attention. She had heard him say so to the steward in October. Now he was saying that the south wing could be turned out for Lucian's people, after, and that there were rooms on the riverside that took the morning light handsomely, and the captain was answering that he had never cared for morning light, and they were laughing again, both of them, that easy, open laugh, and Charlotte stood at the chest and listened to her husband plan the redecoration of the house she had brought into the marriage as part of the Varenne settlement. The house her grandmother had been born in, and she did not move. She would move when she had heard the rest. That was the decision her body made before her mind caught it. Her mind, when it caught up, only nodded. She listened. The candle did not tremble. Behind her, somewhere in the wall, a mouse went about its business, and she heard that too, because a miniaturist's habit is to notice and to keep. Inside her, in the new dark below her ribs, 2 small lives no larger than river pebbles turned in their sleep, and she did not yet know they had turned, only that her hand had gone to the shagreen and stayed there, as if the box were the one steady thing in the room. The candle burned. She listened. She did not move. The plan was laid out the way Theodore laid out a hunt at breakfast, with the same patient charm he used when discussing horses. Lucian asked the questions. Theodore answered them. It was the cadence of 2 men who had said the thing aloud before in pieces, and were now fitting the pieces together for the comfort of hearing it whole. Charlotte heard the word frail first. She heard it twice before she understood it was being used about her. Theodore said the family had a history of weak nerves on the mother's side, which was not true, and which he had not previously claimed to know. And Lucian said that was useful, and Theodore said it would be useful indeed, once she had been brought to bed of the heir. Once. Brought to bed of the heir. There was no plural. He did not know there was a plural. He could not know. She had told no one, not even her own woman, because she had wanted to hold the news against her chest a little longer in case it broke. It had not broken. It had grown. The midwife in the village, who had attended her grandmother and her mother, and who held a tongue better than any duchess Charlotte had met, had laid her ear to Charlotte's belly the week before last and said quietly, "2 hearts, my lady, and not the same beat." Charlotte had walked home along the lane through the wet hedges, with that sentence ringing inside her like a small bell. Not the same beat. 2. Theodore did not know. Theodore was speaking of an heir, singular, as if Charlotte's body were a vessel he had filled and could now set aside. There was a coastal rest house, he was saying, a respectable establishment, discreet attendance. The sea air was thought beneficial for women of nervous constitution. Cousin Maud had spent a peaceful 4 years there before the end, and no one had thought worse of the family for it. Lucian asked about visitors. Theodore said visitors could be regulated. He used that word, regulated, as if Charlotte were weather. The captain laughed the open laugh again, and said something Charlotte did not catch, because a cold had begun to climb the back of her neck, and her ears were full of her own pulse. But she heard the end of Theodore's reply, which was, "And the boy stays here, with us, and we shall manage him handsomely between us." And the laugh after that was not Lucian's, it was Theodore's, and it was the public one, the closed-mouth 3 notes, used now in private, which told Charlotte that the plan was old. She lifted the box. She lifted it with the care of a woman lifting a sleeping child. The shagreen made no sound against the chest. She turned, holding the candle low so the light would not flare in the warped opening of the door, and she walked back across the corridor on her own bare feet, and she did not let her shadow cross the gap. At her own door she set the box down on the table inside, and closed the door behind her without letting the latch click. And only then, with the wood of her own door at her back, did she allow herself one slow breath that went all the way down to the place where the 2 small lives were sleeping. She put her hand flat on the front of her wrapper. She held it there. She said nothing aloud, because there was no one in the room to say it to. But inside the close dark of her chest, she said, very quietly, "All right. All right.
We will not stay here."
Then she went to the writing desk and lit a second candle from the first, because a miniaturist works in 2 lights, and she opened the shagreen case and drew out, from beneath the ivories and the stoppered files and the brushes she trusted, the small flat package wrapped in pale silk that held the likenesses of Captain Lucian Fay. She unwrapped them. She laid them in a row across the desk. There were 5. Each was dated on the reverse in her own concealed cipher of pigment and initial, a smear of madder, a smear of lead tin, a single ground letter in the rim no one but she could read. Each was signed only with the small painted moth she used for her private commissions, the kind no public catalogue knew of. Theodore had brought her the captain for sittings 4 times in 15 months. The 5th she had taken from memory on a day she had been told she was not needed at dinner. The likenesses were good. She had not allowed herself to consider, while painting them, what they were proof of. She considered it now. Then she put them back into the silk, and the silk back into the false bottom of the case, and she sat down at the desk and drew a piece of paper toward her, and dipped a pen, and wrote in her steadiest hand, "To the Dowager Countess of Brede." She did not write what had happened. She wrote that she had a matter of some delicacy concerning a commission, and would be grateful for the Dowager's counsel and her hospitality for a brief stay. She wrote that she would arrive the day after tomorrow, with her painting box, by the post, and that she would be traveling alone but for her own woman, and that she would bring nothing she did not need. She signed her own name, Charlotte Varon, and not the title. She sanded the ink, folded the paper, and addressed it to Brede House, Charlotte Street, and set it aside for the Morning Post. She did not seal it with the Avonmore seal. She used a plain wafer. Then she sat for a moment with both hands flat on the closed shagreen, and looked at the small painted moth on the inside of the lid, which her father had let her paint there the year she turned 12. And she felt the 2 small lives turn again, very lightly, like fish in shallow water. She did not weep. She had not wept in the dressing room, and she would not weep at the desk. There would be time later, if it was needed. For now there was only the box and the letter, and the house she had been brought into as a second figure in a portrait someone else had hung. The candles burned. She did not move. Down the corridor, behind the warped door, the laugh she had not been given went on without her. And Charlotte sat with her hand on the shagreen and listened to the new sound inside her own chest, which was the sound of a woman beginning to count. She had been told once by her father that the trick of a good likeness was to know which feature carried the soul. With some faces it was the mouth, with others the eye, or the line at the bridge of the nose, or a small habitual angle of the chin. He had told her, sitting beside her at his bench in the morning room of the house she had grown up in, that you must find that feature first, before you laid any pigment at all, because if you painted the rest correctly and missed that one, you would have painted a stranger. Charlotte had been 9. She had taken it as gospel and never put it down. She had met Theodore at a county assembly the spring before her father died. He had stood across the room with 2 glasses in his hands and looked at her over the rim of one of them, and she had thought at the time that the feature carrying his soul was the mouth, which was wide and amused and a little tired. She had been wrong. She understood now, sitting at her desk at 3 a.m. with 5 small painted moths in a row in her false bottom, that the feature carrying her husband's soul had been the angle at which he held his shoulders when he was being looked at. She had painted him twice in their marriage, once for the long gallery and once for his sister's locket, and both times she had got the shoulders correctly, because she had been looking at him through the small window of a miniaturist's distance, and she had not bothered to ask what stood behind them. She did not blame herself for that. She had been 22 and orphaned, and the estates adjoined, and her mother's brother had said it was a fine match, and Theodore had been charming, and the charm had been real in its way, only it had been the charm of a man who needed her as a kind of furniture. She had taken the offer because the alternative had been a smaller life, and she had thought a larger life was the same thing as a better one. That was the only mistake she would allow herself to count, and she counted it once and set it aside. In the dressing room, the laugh had stopped. Charlotte heard, faintly, the creak of the bedstead and then quiet. She did not move. She waited until the house was the kind of quiet a house only becomes after 3, and then she rose and put out the candles one at a time, and lay down in her own bed, with the shagreen on the floor beside it, within reach of her hand, and she did not sleep, but she did not weep either. And at the first grey of the window she rose again, and rang for her woman, and said, in a voice that surprised her with its evenness, "We are going up to town tomorrow. Pack the small trunk only. I will carry the painting box myself." Her woman, whose name was Annis, and who had been with her since the year of her father's death, did not ask why. Annis had a face like a closed drawer, and the loyalty of a woman who had nowhere else to be loyal, and Charlotte had counted that, too, among the small facts she kept. Annis only said, "Very well, my lady," and went to the press for the trunk, and Charlotte went down to the breakfast room to face her husband. Theodore was already at the table when she came in, reading a letter and eating toast. He looked up and smiled the public smile. He had washed and shaved and dressed in the bottle-green coat she had once admired, and there was nothing in his face to say that he had spent the night planning her removal. She had not expected there to be. She came to the table and took her usual chair, and let Annis pour her tea, and she lifted the cup and held it in both hands a moment before she drank, because her hands were not steady, and she needed them to look as if they were. "Are you well?" Theodore said, without putting down the letter. "Quite well," she answered. He looked at her then, a fraction longer than usual, because something in her voice had caught his ear without his being able to name it, and Charlotte returned his look across the toast rack and the silver pot, and felt, for the first time in 3 years, that she could see his shoulders and what stood behind them at once. She did not let it show in her face. She had a miniaturist's hands and a miniaturist's eye, and now, it seemed, a miniaturist's face as well, the kind that gave back only what it was painted to give. She took a small bite of toast. He went back to his letter. "I shall go up to town tomorrow," she said, when she had finished the toast. "The Dowager Countess of Brede has written for a sitting. I had meant to put her off, but she is not a woman one puts off twice." Theodore raised an eyebrow without raising his head. "Brede. Lady Cordelia Brede, yes. She wants a likeness of her grandson before he is sent up to school." Theodore set down the letter. The Dowager was a name he did not take lightly, because the Dowager was patron to 3 of the artists whose work hung in his long gallery, and patron to a 4th who had painted the king's youngest niece, and a woman who held opinions the way some men held mortgages. Theodore had hoped, over the course of the marriage, to be invited to Brede House for one of her musical evenings, and the invitation had never come. He did not like to be reminded of that. He composed his face. "How long?" he asked. A week,
Possibly 10 days. The light at the season is short. I shall want every hour of it. Theodore considered. She could see him considering. He was weighing, behind the bottle-green coat, what use he could make of her absence, whether she would be conveniently out of the way while certain preparations were set in motion downstairs, whether a week in town under the dowager's roof was a thing he could spin into county conversation as a sign of her artistic seriousness, or as the first hint of nervous fatigue. She watched him weigh it. She drank her tea. "Take Annis," he said at last. "I plan to. And the small carriage. The post is unsuited to a woman in your condition." Charlotte set down her cup. Her hand was steady now. He had said it lightly, as one says a kindness, and she felt the small cold of it go down her throat with the tea, because if he had been told of her condition, he had been told by the midwife, or by Annis, or by some other small mouth in the house she had thought trustworthy, and either way, it meant he had been counting too. He had not been certain enough to mention it openly until now, but he had been counting. The plan in the dressing room was older than the dressing room. "That is kind," she said. "I shall take the small carriage, then." He smiled the public smile and lifted his letter again. Charlotte rose and made him a small civil curtsy, the kind she had given him every morning of their marriage, and left the breakfast room, and walked along the corridor at a pace that did not betray her, and went up the back stairs to her own room, and closed the door behind her, and stood with her back to it for a moment in the cool of her own four walls. Then she went to the shagreen case, and opened it, and lifted out the small painted moth in the lid, and looked at it. The moth had been her father's joke, and her own private sign, and she had painted it the morning after he had told her about the feature that carried the soul. She had painted it well. She traced the edge of one wing with her smallest finger and put the lid back down. Then she sat at the desk and wrote a second letter, this one to the Dowager Countess directly, asking that a midwife of the Dowager's choosing be present in the house when she arrived. She did not give a reason. She signed her name again, Charlotte Varon, without the title, and addressed it, and gave both letters to Annis when Annis came up with the trunk, and said, very plainly, "These are to go by the early post, and you are to walk them to the village yourself." Annis nodded once and went. Charlotte sat down on the edge of the bed and put both hands flat on the front of her gown, and waited for the two small lives to turn again. They turned, she breathed. The day went on around her, and downstairs Theodore wrote letters of his own, and somewhere in the south wing the steward was being told, in a voice that brooked no argument, that the riverside rooms were to be aired out the following week, and Charlotte, who had no way of hearing that conversation, sat upstairs and counted the hours until the small carriage would be brought round. She left the house at 9 the next morning. She wore the dark blue traveling gown that had been her mother's, and that had been altered 3 times in 3 years to fit her differently, and the bonnet with the grey ribbon, and her own gloves, and she carried the shagreen case in her own hands across the gravel of the sweep, because she did not trust it to a footman. Theodore came down to see her off. He kissed her once on the cheek, a dry kiss in front of the household, and helped her into the carriage with the careful courtesy he had always shown when there were eyes to see it. Annis climbed up after her with the small trunk. The coachman set the horses. Theodore stood on the steps with his hand raised. Charlotte looked at him through the carriage window, at the bottle-green coat and the wide, tired mouth, and she did not lift her own hand. She rested it instead on the lid of the shagreen case on her lap. He watched her go without dropping the smile, and she watched him watch her,
and when the carriage turned at the lodge and the lime avenue closed over the view, she did not look back. The road to town took the better part of the day. She passed the lane to the village where the midwife lived, and she passed the bridge where the river ran high in autumn, and she passed the long flat fields she had walked in October, when the news had been only a possibility, and not yet 2 heartbeats. And she let none of it move her face. Annis sat opposite with her hands folded and her eyes lowered, and the shagreen sat between them on the seat, and Charlotte rested her gloved hand on the lid as if on a child's head. She did not sleep. She did not eat the bread Annis offered her at the change of horses. She drank a little water. She watched the country pass and the light shift and the light begin to fail, and she counted. Breed House stood in a quiet street behind the great square, set back from the pavement by a small forecourt with 2 clipped bays in tubs and a lamp already lit above the door. The Dowager Countess's footman was waiting on the step. He had been told, evidently, to expect her. He came down without hurry, opened the carriage door himself, offered his arm, and asked, very civilly, whether her ladyship would prefer to bring in the painting box herself, or have it carried. "I shall carry it," Charlotte said. He bowed. He stepped back. She came down out of the carriage with the shagreen against her side and walked under the lamp and into the front hall of Breed House, and the door closed behind her with a small, definite sound that the door at Avonmore had not made in 3 years of warping. The Dowager Countess of Breed received her in the small library at the back of the house, where a fire was lit and a tea-tray stood ready, and the curtains had been drawn against the early dark. She was a small, square woman of 70 or so, with very white hair pinned high, and a black silk gown, and a pair of dark eyes that did not move as much as eyes commonly do. She was sitting in a high-backed chair near the fire, with a book closed in her lap, and she did not rise when Charlotte came in, only inclined her head and gestured to the chair opposite. "Sit," she said. Charlotte sat. She set the shagreen case on the little table at her elbow. The Dowager looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "You walked in here carrying that box yourself, with your own hands, after a day's journey in your condition, and you did not give it to my man at the door. So you are either very rude or very frightened, and I do not think you are rude." Charlotte said nothing. The fire crackled. The Dowager nodded once, as if a question had been answered. "Drink your tea. Then you will tell me what is in the box, and we shall see what is to be done." Charlotte lifted the cup. Her hand, this time, did not tremble at all. She drank. She set down the cup. She put both palms flat on the shagreen, the way she had at the desk in her own room 2 nights before, and she felt the small painted moth under the wood, and the 5 wrapped likenesses under the false bottom, and the ivories above them, and the phials of ground pigment alongside. And she felt also, lower down, the 2 small lives turning in the new dark, and she lifted the lid. Lady Cordelia Breed watched her open the box, and watched her lift the false bottom, and watched her draw out the silk-wrapped package, and watched her unwrap it on the little table between them in the firelight. The 5 small ovals lay in a row on the silk. Captain Lucian Fay in profile. Captain Lucian Fay in 3/4 face. Captain Lucian Fay in the bottle-green dressing-gown that did not belong to him. Captain Lucian Fay reading Captain Lucien Fay from memory. Asleep with his cheek against a pillow Charlotte recognized because she had embroidered the edge of it the 2nd year of her marriage. The Dowager looked at them in silence. Then she looked at Charlotte. Then she looked at the silk, and back at Charlotte again. "These are very fine," she said at last. "Thank you," said Charlotte. The dowager touched the edge of the third miniature with the tip of one finger, not the painted surface, only the rim. She turned it over. She saw the smear of madder and the smear of lead tin and the single ground letter in the rim, and she did not ask what they meant. She set the oval down again on the silk. "Whose pillow?" "Mine, from my husband's bed." The Dowager Countess of Brede sat very still for the length of 3 slow breaths. Then she said, in the same dry, even voice she had used to tell Charlotte to sit, "Well, that is a different matter." She rang the small bell at her elbow. The footman came. She said, "Mrs. Holloway is to be sent for. Tonight. Tell her it is the matter we spoke of yesterday, and she is to bring her bag. And tell Henson to lock the front door, and to admit no one without my word, not the king's own messenger." The footman bowed and went. The dowager turned back to Charlotte. She folded her small square hands in her lap. "Now, tell me everything you saw, in the order you saw it, and do not spare me the parts that do not flatter you. I cannot help a woman who edits." Charlotte looked at the 5 small ovals on the silk in the firelight, at the cipher in the rim that no one in the world could read but her, and she put her hand flat on the lid of the shagreen, and she began at the warped door. She talked for the better part of an hour. The dowager did not interrupt. She listened with her dark eyes on Charlotte's face, and her hands folded, and her small square shoulders very still. And when Charlotte had finished, she did not exclaim or sympathize, or use any of the words polite women use to fill silences. She only said, after a moment, "You said heir, singular, when you repeated him. Was that his word, or yours?" "His. And the truth. 2. The midwife in our village heard them last week. Not the same beat." The dowager's hands did not move in her lap, but something passed across her face that was not a smile, and not a frown, and that Charlotte filed away as a thing she would think about later. The dowager said, very quietly, "Then your husband does not know what he is reaching for?" "No." "Good. We shall not tell him yet." The fire burned. The clock on the chimney-piece struck 8. Somewhere at the front of the house a bell rang and was answered, and a woman's voice spoke briefly in the hall and was admitted, and Mrs. Holloway, who was a wide-faced midwife of about 50, with a Yorkshire vowl and very clean hands, came into the small library with her bag and her shawl still on her shoulders, and the dowager said, "Mrs. Holloway, this is the Duchess of Avonmore. You will examine her this evening, and you will tell me what you find, and you will write nothing down that you do not first read aloud to me." Mrs. Holloway said, "Very well, my lady," and inclined her head to Charlotte without curiosity, and Charlotte rose, and went with her up the back stairs to the bedroom that had been prepared at the end of the passage, and Annis followed with the trunk. The shagreen case Charlotte carried herself. She did not put it down until it was on the dressing-table beside the bed, within reach of her hand, with the lid closed and the false bottom intact, and the 5 small wrapped ovals of Captain Lucien Fay nesting quietly beneath her brushes and her ivories and her stoppered files, like a charge of powder waiting for a flint. Mrs. Holloway was a thorough woman, and an unhurried one. She washed her hands in the basin Annis brought, and she warmed them at the fire, and she spoke to Charlotte in the steady, half-aloud manner of a woman who had been at the work since she was 16. And Charlotte lay back on the bed with the curtains undrawn, and let herself be touched, and listened to, and counted over, by hands that wanted nothing of her but a true reading. when Mrs. Holloway laid her ear against Charlotte's belly and held it there for a long, quiet minute. Charlotte watched the ceiling and felt the 2 small lives turn under the midwife's ear. And Mrs. Holloway lifted her head at last and said, in her flat Yorkshire voice, 2, my lady, and not the same beat. The smaller one is to the left and a touch lower. They are doing nicely. Charlotte closed her eyes. It was the closest she had come, since the dressing room, to weeping, and she did not. She put her hand over her face for a moment, and then lowered it. Tell the Countess. Mrs. Holloway nodded and went out. Annis came forward and helped Charlotte sit up, and brought her a clean shift, and brushed her hair, and did not speak, because Annis had understood by then that not speaking was the better service, and Charlotte sat on the edge of the bed in the clean shift and looked at the shagreen case on the dressing table and felt, for the first time since the warped door, that her feet were on a floor that was hers. She slept that night. She had not expected to. The bed was unfamiliar, and the street outside the window had carriages in it, and the house breathed differently from Avonmore, but she slept the dead-dropped sleep of a woman who had set a thing down at last. And when she woke at first light, the shagreen was still on the dressing-table, and the small painted moth in the lid was waiting for her where it had always been, and Annis was kneeling at the grate, building up the fire. The Dowager Countess sent for her at 11. They sat again in the small library at the back of the house. The 5 ovals were no longer on the silk on the little table. The Dowager had had them locked in a drawer of the secretaire, whose key she wore on a thin chain inside the high collar of her gown. The shagreen case was on the floor at Charlotte's feet, where she had brought it down with her, because she had decided in the night that she would not let it out of arm's reach until she had decided what to do with it, and the Dowager had not asked her to. No, we must consider your husband. Yes. He will write to you within the week. He will write twice. The first letter will be loving and concerned, and will mention your nerves. The second letter, if you do not answer the first, will mention a coastal house. Charlotte folded her hands in her lap. You have read his sort before. I have buried 2 of them before you ask. Not by my own hand. Men of that kind die obligingly on their own. The trouble is the time between. I do not wish to wait for him to die. The Dowager looked at her for a long moment, and then she smiled for the first time. A small, dry smile that lifted only one corner of her mouth. Good. Neither do I. She rang the bell. The footman came with a tray of writing things and set it on the table between them. The Dowager dipped a pen and drew a fresh sheet of paper toward herself and said, You will dictate to me a letter to your husband, and I shall write it, because his eye knows your hand, and we shall keep your hand for things that matter more. You will tell him you have arrived safely. You will tell him the Dowager has put you to work on her grandson's likeness, and that the sittings are going well. You will tell him that the light is short, and you shall be 10 days at least, and that you are very tired in the evenings, which he will read as he wishes. You will not mention the child. I shall not. You will sign it Charlotte, not Charlotte Varenne, not the title, only Charlotte, the way you used to sign letters to your father when you were 16 and at school. I never went to school. To your father, then, when he sent you to your aunt's for the summer. How do you know about my aunt? I knew your father. He painted a very small portrait of my husband the year I married him. It hangs in this house. I have looked at it most days for 41 years. You have his hands. Charlotte sat very still. That is one of the reasons,
the Dowager went on, equably, that I answered your letter the morning it came, and that Mrs. Holloway is upstairs in the front bedroom this morning, eating a kipper at my expense, and that the men who watch this house from the street watch it for me, and not for him. That, and the fact that I have disliked the Duke of Avonmore for 9 years, on the small and adequate ground that he stood in my drawing-room once, and corrected my pronunciation of a French painter's name. Now, dictate your letter. Charlotte dictated her letter. The Dowager wrote it out in her own clear, slightly old-fashioned hand, and Charlotte signed it. Only Charlotte, the way she had signed letters to her father, and the Dowager sanded it and sealed it with her own seal, which was a small ship under sail, and gave it to the footman to go by the next post. Then the Dowager turned back to Charlotte and folded her hands again. Now, the miniatures. Yes. What do you want done with them? Charlotte considered. The fire crackled. Somewhere upstairs a door closed, and Mrs. Holloway's voice could be heard, faintly, saying something kind to Annis. The 2 small lives turned to the new dark below Charlotte's ribs, and she rested her hand on the front of her gown and felt them, and thought, I want to make him understand that they exist. I do not want to show them yet. I want him to know, by his own working out, that there is a thing he cannot reach, and that the thing is held by someone he cannot afford to offend. Then we shall not write to him about them. We shall write to his sister. His sister. Lady Margaret Varon is a sensible woman, and is fond of you. She is also fond of her own children, and of the family name, and she is the only person in your husband's life whose disapproval he will feel as cold, rather than as inconvenience. We shall write to her. We shall ask her, very civilly, whether she has any recollection of a Captain Lucien Fay, who, we shall say, has been recommended to me for a small private commission, and who, we understand, is an intimate of her brother's household. We shall say no more than that. She is intelligent. She will understand at once that something has been seen, because women who are fond of brothers like yours have been waiting their whole lives to hear the thing said. Charlotte looked at the Dowager for a long time. You have done this before. I have done variations of it, not this exact one. Your case is new. Charlotte nodded slowly. She felt, somewhere under the careful arrangement of her face, a small shift, the kind a building makes when it settles on its foundation after a storm. She put her hand back on the shagreen. Write to Margaret. The Dowager wrote to Margaret. She wrote in her own hand and her own voice, with no mention of Charlotte beyond a passing line at the end. Her Grace of Avonmore is staying with me this fortnight, and asks to be remembered to you most warmly. And she sealed it with the ship under sail, and sent it by the same post as the letter to Theodore, so that brother and sister should receive their letters within the same hour. Charlotte sat by the fire while the Dowager wrote, and watched the lamplight on the white head bent over the paper. And she understood, in a way she had not understood at the warped door, what the Dowager Countess Abreed meant by leverage. It was not threat. It was the careful placement of 3 small weights along a beam, so that the beam, when it began to tip, would tip the way when wanted. Theodore's first letter arrived 4 days later. It was loving and concerned, and mentioned her nerves. Charlotte read it once, standing at the window of the small library, with the morning light on the paper, and then she handed it to the Dowager without comment, and the Dowager read it, and laid it on the fire, and said, The second will come within 5 days. We shall see whether Margaret has answered by then. Margaret answered the next morning. Her letter was addressed to the Dowager, but it was meant for Charlotte, and the Dowager handed it across the breakfast table without opening it. Charlotte broke the seal.
Margaret had written 4 short paragraphs in a careful hand, the first 3 concerning the weather and her children's lessons, and a recipe for quince preserve, and the 4th, very quietly, saying that she had indeed met Captain Fay at her brother's house on more than one occasion, and that she had formed her own opinion of him some time ago, and that if Charlotte ever found herself in want of a quiet country house for a confinement, she would be most welcome at Margaret's, and that she had taken the liberty of writing separately to a discreet acquaintance in town, who managed a small private fund for women in delicate situations, and that the acquaintance had been instructed to call at Breed House at Charlotte's convenience. She signed the letter "Your loving sister Margaret," and underlined the word "loving." Charlotte folded the letter slowly. She handed it to the Dowager. The Dowager read it, and read it again, and laid it carefully aside. She knows. She has known longer than you. That is the use of sisters. Theodore's second letter arrived 3 days after that. It mentioned a coastal house. It mentioned very gently the rest and quiet that a woman of nervous constitution required in the months before her confinement. And it mentioned, more gently still, that he had taken the liberty of riding ahead to an establishment near Lyme that had been highly recommended, and that he proposed to come to town himself within the week to escort her there in person. He signed it, "Your devoted husband." Charlotte read it standing by the same window. She did not hand this one to the Dowager at once. She held it in her hand for a moment and looked out at the street below, at a girl crossing the pavement with a basket of laundry on her hip, at the lamplighter walking his ladder, at the ordinary business of a town that did not know her, and she felt, somewhere very low and very quiet, the small, bright flicker of an anger she had not yet permitted herself. She handed the letter to the Dowager. The Dowager read it. She did not put it on the fire. She folded it carefully and laid it inside the secretaire drawer beside the 5 ovals. Now we begin to answer. They answered him together. They sat in the small library through the long November afternoon, and they wrote, between them, the document that would be presented to him when he arrived. A brief and entirely civil letter from Charlotte, saying that she had decided to remain with the Dowager Countess for the present, that she was in excellent health, and that any communication regarding the management of the Avonmore estate, or the welfare of the children, should be addressed to her solicitor, whose name and direction she gave, and whom the Dowager had retained that morning on Charlotte's behalf. The letter mentioned children, plural. It was the first time Theodore would see the word in the plural in Charlotte's hand. They placed it deliberately, in the middle of a sentence, with no flourish, the way one places a small stone in a wall to mark a corner. Then, on a separate sheet, in the Dowager's hand, was a single short line. Her Grace's painting box contains a series of likenesses dated and keyed in her own private cipher. The Dowager Countess of Breed has examined them, and finds them very fine. Charlotte read the second sheet through twice. She set it down. He will understand. He will understand that you have made yourself the one person in the kingdom who can ruin him, and that you have done so without raising your voice. He will understand that the children whose number you have just told him walked out of his house inside you. He will understand, if he has any wit at all, that the line he was so confident of is no longer his to dispose of as he pleases. And he will understand, lastly, that the Dowager Countess of Breed is not a woman one corrects in French. Charlotte almost smiled. She did not quite. She put her hand on the shagreen. When does he come? He has written that he will come within the week. Therefore, he will come the day after tomorrow. Men of that kind always come earlier than they say, in the belief that they will catch you in something. We shall be ready for him. He came the day after tomorrow. He came at 11 in the morning, in his town carriage, with 2 grooms and his own valet, and he sent up his card to the Dowager Countess of Brede with a brief written request to see his wife. The Dowager received the card in the small library, and turned it over once in her square white hand, and said to the footman, "Show his Grace into the morning-room, and tell him I shall be down directly, and tell the Duchess that I shall be grateful for her company there." Charlotte came down. She wore the dark blue gown again, and she carried the shagreen case in her own hands. She had told the Dowager the night before that she would not be parted from it during the interview, and the Dowager had not argued. She walked into the morning-room behind the Dowager Countess, and she set the shagreen on the small table by the window, and she sat in the chair the Dowager indicated, and she looked at her husband across a Persian carpet for the first time in 12 days. He was in the bottle-green coat. He had washed and shaved and put scent on, and he had arranged his face into the careful expression of a worried husband. And the careful expression did not quite reach his eyes, because his eyes were busy. They went first to Charlotte's face, and then to her hands, and then to her waist, which was still hidden by the cut of the gown, and then, briefly and unmistakably, to the shagreen case on the small table by the window. He had not seen the shagreen case for 12 days. He had, perhaps, not previously considered it. He considered it now. Theodore. Charlotte. The Dowager seated herself in the high-backed chair by the fire, and folded her hands in her lap, and did not speak. Theodore glanced at her once, and the Dowager returned the glance without expression, and Theodore took the chair opposite Charlotte and arranged his coat. "You look well." "I am well." "I have been concerned. Your letters have been brief." "The Dowager has kept me very occupied. The grandson's likeness is nearly done." He inclined his head. He was choosing his ground carefully. He glanced again briefly at the shagreen. "I came because there is a matter we must discuss, and it is not a matter for letters." "I had thought as much." He smiled the public smile. It did not quite hold. "You are with child. We have not spoken of it openly. I think the time has come." Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. "The time came some while ago. I had thought it might come to you sooner." The public smile flickered. He recovered it. "My dear, you must understand that a woman in your condition, particularly a woman whose constitution is not robust— my constitution is excellent." He paused. He had not expected to be interrupted, and he had certainly not expected to be contradicted in his own opening move. Charlotte continued, in the same even voice. "I have been examined by Mrs. Holloway, the Dowager's own midwife, who is the most experienced practitioner in the parish. She has reported that I am in robust health, and that the pregnancy is progressing without any difficulty whatever. She has also, Theodore, confirmed what our village midwife confirmed 3 weeks ago, which is that I am carrying twins. The smaller, she tells me, is to the left and a touch lower. They are doing nicely." The morning room was very quiet. The fire shifted. The Dowager did not move in her chair. Theodore's mouth opened and then closed again, and Charlotte watched, with a miniaturist's eye, the feature that carried his soul, which was the angle at which he held his shoulders, slacken by perhaps 1/8 of an inch, and reset itself, and slacken again. Twins. 2. Not the same beat. He sat back. He drew a breath. He composed himself. "My dear, this is all the more reason—" It is all the reason I have needed to come to certain decisions about how matters will proceed." She did not raise her voice. She did not move her hands. She kept them folded in her lap, the way she had seen the dowager keep hers, and she said, "I shall be remaining in town for the duration of the pregnancy. The Dowager Countess has been so kind as to offer me her hospitality for as long as I wish to accept it, and I have accepted it. After my confinement, which Mrs. Holloway places in late March, I shall not be returning to Avonmore. Lady Margaret has offered me her house at Welton for as long as I require, and I shall go there with the children when they are old enough to travel. The children, Theodore, will be with me." He stared at her. "You are speaking of separation." "I am speaking of an arrangement, which my solicitor will set out in writing for your solicitor, and which both of them will, I think, find acceptable. The Avonmore settlement is straightforward. The two estates may continue to be held jointly under the terms my uncle drew up, with the income from the Veron lands paid into a trust for the children. You will retain the use of the house. You will not, however, retain the use of me, or of them, or of the connection to the Brede and Welton households that my position currently affords you. I think you will find, on consideration, that this is a generous arrangement." He had gone very still. He looked at Charlotte for a long moment, and then his eyes went, for the third time, to the shagreen case on the small table by the window. They lingered there. He looked back at Charlotte. "What is in the box?" "My work." His tongue touched his lower lip. "May I see it?" "No." He smiled faintly. It was not the public smile any more. It was something thinner. "Charlotte." She did not answer. She kept her hands folded in her lap. The Dowager Countess, by the fire, lifted her own small square hand and rested it lightly on the arm of her chair. And Theodore's eye caught the gesture, and he turned his head slightly toward the Dowager. "His Grace perhaps wishes me to speak plainly, since the Duchess is too well bred to do so." Theodore did not answer. "Her Grace has placed in my keeping a small series of portrait miniatures of an officer of your acquaintance, painted by her own hand over the past 15 months. They are dated. They are keyed in a cipher of her own devising that is known to her alone, and which the Royal Academy will, I am quite sure, recognize as hers should it ever be necessary to demonstrate authorship, which it will not be, because no one in this room is foolish enough to require such a demonstration. The miniatures are presently in a locked drawer in this house. They will remain there. They will not be shown to anyone, and they will not be spoken of by anyone, on 3 conditions." She paused. She let the silence settle. "The first is that you will sign whatever document Her Grace's solicitor places before you regarding the arrangement she has just described, and you will sign it without amendment. The second is that you will make no application, public or private, to have your wife declared frail, infirm, nervous, indisposed, or in any other way unfit to manage her own affairs or her own children. The third is that you will, at no point hereafter, attempt to remove the children from her care, by law or by hand, by petition or by persuasion, by any means whatever. Do those 3 things, Your Grace, and the miniatures will remain in the drawer for the rest of your life and mine, and very probably for the rest of your children's. Fail to do them, and the miniatures will leave the drawer." Theodore looked at the Dowager. He looked at Charlotte. He looked at the shagreen case on the table by the window. He did not speak. Charlotte said, quietly, "The children are not negotiable, Theodore. The estate is. The arrangement is. They are not." He sat for a long moment, His face went through several arrangements before it found one it could hold. At last he said, in a voice that was very nearly steady, "You are taking my heir." "I am taking my children. They were never yours in the way you wanted them to be. You did not know there were two of them. You did not know there was a cipher in the box. You did not know which feature carried my soul because you never asked. You presented my work as your taste. You presented our marriage as your taste. You will not present my children as your line." His shoulders at last did not reset. She rose. She did so slowly and with care, because her balance had begun to shift in these last weeks, and she did not wish to alter it in front of him. She took up the shagreen case from the table by the window and held it in both hands against the front of her gown. "I shall not write to you again. My solicitor will write. You will receive his letter within the week. I should advise you to sign it. I should advise you to remember, when you are tempted not to sign it, that you laid out a great many particulars about the south wing in the hearing of a warped door that has never latched, and that the woman on the other side of the warped door has a very good ear and a steady hand. I should advise you also to be kind to Captain Fay. He has been used badly enough by his own commanding officer." Theodore opened his mouth. "Good morning." She walked out of the morning room with the shagreen against her front, and the two small lives turning beneath it, and she did not look back to see his face, because she had already painted it, in her mind, the way her father had taught her, the angle of the shoulders and what stood behind them, and she knew she would not need to paint it again. She went up the stairs to her own room. Annis was there. Annis took the shagreen from her hands without being asked, and set it on the dressing table beside the bed. Charlotte sat down on the edge of the bed and put her hands flat on the front of her gown, and breathed slowly until the small bright flicker of anger under her ribs had settled into something steadier and more useful. And then she rose and went to the dressing table and opened the box and lifted the lid and looked at the small painted moth her father had let her paint when she was 12. And she traced the edge of one wing with her smallest finger and closed the lid again. Downstairs, in the morning room, the Dowager Countess of Brede was, she presumed, seeing the Duke of Avonmore to the door. She did not need to be present for that. He signed the document. He signed it 4 days later, in his solicitor's office in the city, without amendment. He signed it because the Dowager Countess had been correct. He was not, in the end, a foolish man, only a vain one, and the vain understand leverage when it is laid out in front of them with the cool good manners of someone who has done this before. Captain Lucian Fay left the country a fortnight after that, on a posting to the Cape, which Charlotte was given to understand had been arranged by certain friends of the Dowagers in the Admiralty, and which Lucian had accepted, according to the small, clean letter he sent to Brede House without signature, with a kind of relief he had not previously known he was permitted to feel. Charlotte read the letter once and folded it and put it in the false bottom of the shagreen with the 5 small ovals, because it seemed to belong there, and she did not show it to the Dowager, and the Dowager did not ask. Charlotte stayed at Brede House through the winter. She painted the Dowager's grandson, and then the Dowager herself, who had not sat for a likeness in 20 years, and grumbled all through the sittings and stayed for every one of them. She painted a small oval of Lady Margaret, sent by post to Welton, that Margaret wrote back to call the kindest portrait she had ever been given. She painted, on a quiet afternoon in February, herself, looking directly out of the ivory with both hands resting on the front of her gown,
the only self-portrait she had ever made, and she dated it in her cipher and signed it with the small painted moth, and put it, too, into the false bottom of the shagreen. The twins were born in late March, as Mrs. Holloway had said they would be, at Breed House, in the front bedroom with the good light. A girl first, very small and very loud, and a boy after, smaller still and quieter, the one to the left and a touch lower, exactly as Mrs. Holloway had heard him through the wall of Charlotte's body all winter.
Charlotte named the girl Iris for her own mother, and the boy Henry for her father, and she did not write to Theodore at any point in the months that followed about either of them. She went to Welton in May, when the children were old enough to travel. Lady Margaret met them at the front door of the small dower house she had had aired for them, and took the girl out of Charlotte's arms without a word, and held her against her shoulder with the easy, practised hand of a woman who had had 4 of her own, and said, very quietly, into Charlotte's ear, "You have done very well, my dear." Charlotte did not weep then either, but it was a closer thing than it had been at Mrs. Holloway's ear in November. The shagreen case came with her. It sat on the dressing table in the dower house, within reach of her hand. The 5 small ovals of Captain Lucien Fay were no longer in it. They had remained, by Charlotte's choice, in the locked drawer of the secretaire at Breed House, where the Dowager had said they would, because the Dowager had been right about that too. Leverage held its weight best when it stayed exactly where it had first been placed. Charlotte set out her ivories on the dower house table the morning after they arrived. The light at Welton was very fine, particularly in the late afternoon. She had 3 commissions waiting, and a 4th promised from a friend of Margaret's in the next county, and she had decided, on the journey down, that she would sign her work openly from now on, with her own name and not only the painted moth, because the moth had been her father's joke, and a private sign. And a private sign was a thing one kept for the work one could not afford to claim, and she could afford to claim hers now. She mixed her first colors. The children slept in the next room under Annis's eye. Outside the window, the lime trees at the corner of the garden were just coming into leaf. She set down the brush for a moment, and laid her palm flat on the lid of the shagreen, and felt the small painted moth under the wood, and the empty silk wrapper still folded in the false bottom, and the brushes she trusted, and the ivories above them, and the phials of ground pigment alongside, and she thought, very briefly, of a walked door that did not latch, and of a candle that had not trembled. And then she picked up the brush again, and went on. I keep thinking about the moment she heard the laugh she had never been given, and did not move, and what would have happened if she had pushed the door, or dropped the candle, or spoken from the dark side of the frame. There are more stories that turn on a single held breath like that one. Subscribe, and you'll catch the next when it comes. See you then.